All right. So hi, I'm Ben Kelley again. I'm co-chair of the Brookline Parents Organization. I've been co-chair of the Brookline Parents Organization for some time, along with Lauren Bernard, who can't make it right now. Hopefully, she can make it later. Um, and the BPO has, worked for many years to be a kind of townwide advocacy organization for parents and caregivers, for all things related to the schools and education in town, from school committee races to recess, gardening, academics, literacy, and more. Um, and we are, very concerned about the, fiscal issues that are going on in the town, and the override seems to be very important to the future health of our schools and our town. And so for that reason, we assembled this panel and created this event for this evening, to kind of talk really a little bit more and in depth about what is really at stake. Like, why are we here? How did we get here? What are the issues? What's at stake? What does override do? And what's the long-term, thinking on the part of the town? And so to talk about this, we have joined by Sadaf Kazmi, who was on the Expenditures and Revenues Committee for over a year, studying the town's expenditures and revenues, and then recommending this override. So Sadaf grew up in Brookline. She's a proud product of the Brookline Public Schools. She moved back to Brookline in 2019 with her husband and two young daughters, who now attend the Lawrence School, just like she did. Sadaf serves on the Lawrence Site Council and is a member of the Brookline Expenditures and Revenue Study Committee, or was a member, if the committee, I think, does not technically exist anymore. Professionally, Sadaf has worked in tech and product management for over 20 years. She has a BSc from University of Pennsylvania School of Engineering, a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and an MBA from Wharton. So thank you, Sadaf. Dr. Bob Weintraub is with us. He served as the head of school at Brookline High School from 1992 to 2011 as a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at both Columbia University Teachers College and Boston University. He's co-founder and current board chair of the Calculus Project, a New York City native, and the parent of 3 alumni of the public schools of Brookline. And he is also a current member of the Brookline School Committee. And last but certainly not least, David Pearlman is a near lifelong Brookline resident and graduate, K-12 attendee of the Brookline Schools, graduate of Brookline High. He served as the member of the Brookline School Committee for 6 years and as chair for 2 years, in addition to serving on several other town level committees and being a town meeting member. David is a current member of the Brookline Select Board, where he's vice chair. He's a child welfare attorney at the trial and appellate levels and is a graduate of Brandeis University and Boston University School of Law. So thank you, Sadaf, Bob, and David, for joining us. I will get right into it. Oh, first I'll say, we have a lot of questions. I expect this will take most of the time that we have. If you have questions that you want to ask, follow-ups or whatever, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. We'll monitor it as best we can. If we can answer in the Q&A, we will. If we can ask them live, we will also do that. But we'll do the best we can given the time that we have. So question 1, I'll ask you guys if you can please summarize the town's current financial situation and how we got here. And if Sadaf, if you could begin.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And it's good to be here. Thank you to everybody who's joining. Brookline is in a situation where we have what's called a structural deficit. And a structural deficit, for people who aren't aware, is a persistent longer term budget imbalance that occurs sometimes where your expenses exceed your revenue over a longer period of time. It's not just kind of a 1-year deficit where you resolve it, and then you're sort of back to a set of balanced books in subsequent years. And this exists not just on the town side, but also on the school side. So it's sort of a, broader town level issue. Really, the driver here is that property tax revenues in Brookline account for about 80% of the overall operating revenue that we take in. And those can only be increased by 2.5% due to Proposition 2.5, which many people are familiar with. So that is a Massachusetts law that caps the increase of the tax levy on an annual basis. Other revenue sources are things like local receipts, so parking fines, the hotel room tax, and some level of state aid that we get. Those tend to be a little bit harder to forecast, and they've been relatively flat in recent years. Um, Over the last number of years, what you typically see is that when you adjust for inflation, the actual growth of revenues is only about 1.5%, right? So costs are growing, and revenues are sort of not, keeping pace in the same way. Expenses, on the other hand, are the growth of expenses is not restricted in the same way that Proposition 2.5 restricts the taxes that you can levy. So this includes everything from unfunded mandates from town meeting, collectively bargained contracts, and then all sorts of other, challenges that all communities in Massachusetts are facing. So inflation, rising cost of healthcare premiums, pensions and healthcare liabilities for retired individuals that we have an obligation to fund. So when you take a look at the overall budget situation and the structural deficit, what we see is that there's a significant increase in the expenses. And that basically eats away at almost entirely what the increase, the Proposition 2.5 increase allows you to generate incrementally year over year. So as a result, a lot of communities in Massachusetts are actually putting overrides on the ballot, or they actually end up having to make significant cuts. So, for example, in fiscal 26, what you saw was that there were 54 communities that actually put overrides on the ballot, and they put something like 70 something overrides on the ballot, 'cause some put multiple on their ballots. And just as a point of comparison, in fiscal 17, that number was 21, right? So this is sort of a growing challenge for communities in Massachusetts. And sort of the salient point here is that Brookline is not alone. When people ask about, why is there limited revenue, or why is the revenue that's allocated to the town or the schools sort of flat year over year, the reason is because there's a series of shared expenses. So that includes things like benefits, and debt service. The increase in revenues that we get is basically taken up by those items that are shared services, largely driven by the benefits component of that line item. So then what's left over to be split between the town and the schools is really flat year over year for the next several years. So that's the situation that we're in. Again, Brookline is not alone in this situation. Many communities in Massachusetts are dealing with the same challenge.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, can I add to that? Thank you, Sadaf. I just want to build on what you said. If anybody's reading the newspapers every day, the Globe, just about every day, there's a big article on a community in Massachusetts that is laying off significant numbers of staff, school and town. Lexington, Massachusetts, which is a very well-run town, for example, they may be laying off 200 teachers next year, unless some genius figures out some way to do it. But there's, Lexington, and then there's Chelsea, and then there's Boston laying off a huge number of people. My downstairs neighbor works for the Boston Public Schools. His colleagues have already received pink slips. So, Boston is a big city. They have commercial development, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, as Sadaf said, Brookline is not alone. And I refer anybody in the audience to check out the Mass Municipal Association's report that was published in October of 2025. It's called A Perfect Storm, Fiscal Crisis in Massachusetts. And the Mass Municipal Association is a pretty credible organization. The report is excellent and also disturbing. So yes, we're not alone. At some point, Massachusetts and the cities and towns have to figure this out. We will, but right now we are in a tough situation along with so many other communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob and Sadaf. The second question was really like, kind of, are we alone in this? And economic factors outside of our control. So I think, is there anything that any of you have to add to that? I think we kind of talked about that. Yes, David, go ahead.
Well, just maybe the specifics of what Brookline's landscape looks like for the next 3 years with these numbers. So we are looking at the an 11% rise in our property taxes over the next 3 years. And that is based on what is already built in for our tax increases from prior debt exclusions and from the annual 2.5% levy. So specifically, even without an override, for FY27, we would be going up a shade over 5%. For FY28, 3.14%. For FY29, 3.1%. In terms of what that looks like for the median single family home, that's about an increase of $2,463 over the next 3 years. For the median value condominium, that is an increase of $1,441 over the next 3 years. That averages to about $820 a year for a single family home and $480 a year for a condominium. Now, if the override passes, as we hope it does, then the total increase over the next 3 years would be about 18%, but the override portion of that would be approximately 7%. And what those numbers look like for FY27, the increase would be 2.96%, or about $9.9 million. For FY28, it would be 1.68%, or approximately $5.6 million. For FY29, it would be 2.35%, approximately $7.8 million. For the median single family home, that would be an additional $3,924 over the 3-year period. For the median condominium, it would be an increase of about $200,296 over the 3 years. In terms of an average, that would be $1,308 a year for the median single family home and $765 a year for a condominium. Another way of looking at this is that on a monthly basis, for every $1 million assessed, you have about a $20 increase per month.
Yeah. And one other thing that I'll add to a little bit building on what Bob had said before is that sometimes people will say, oh, well, what about Cambridge, or what about Somerville, or what about some of these other communities? Tax bases vary quite a bit, right? So you have some communities that have a lot of commercial real estate. Cambridge, I actually lived in Cambridge for 10 years. They have a lot of commercial real estate, so their tax base actually looks very different. Brookline's tax base is, maybe 10 or 15% commercial. Other cities, sort of large, communities like Cambridge, that percentage is actually significantly higher. So that actually changes the overall picture when you look at just sort of comparing a Cambridge, which people bring up a lot, to Brookline.
If I could put a little historical perspective on this whole thing, Ben, would that be possible? Okay, so as most of you know, I've been in the public school business for a really long time, including in Brookline. And I just want to fast backwards to early in my tenure at the high school. And the superintendent then, James Walsh, was a brilliant, wonderful man, good manager of money, said to me at one meeting, you're going to have to cut $500,000 out of your budget for next year. And back in the 90s, $500,000 was real money. And so when you walk into a schoolhouse, what do you see? You see a secretary, you have a couple of counselors probably, you have some custodians, you have some cafeteria workers, you got teachers, counselors, social workers if you're lucky. It's a pretty slimmed down organizational chart in schools. So when I was asked to cut $500,000 out of my budget, that was a major hit. And my basic decision was, because there's not that much to cut in a schoolhouse. We had a pretty robust administrative structure. It was called the house system. Sadaf, you remember that. You were in Robert's house. Anyway, in consultation with my leadership crew, we had to make a decision. Are we going to cut a bunch of teachers or counselors, or can we cut administration? And we decided to decimate the administrative structure of the high school at that point, where we had 4 housemasters, 4 houseteachers, and 4 house secretaries. It's a very expensive model. And so what we did was we eliminated the house system, which had been in effect, had been in existence for 60 years. Pretty controversial to say it's gone. And we created 2 deans, 1 associate dean, and 2 secretaries. Instead of 4 secretaries, 4 houseteachers, and 4 housemasters, which were the most expensive people in the school aside from me. We saved close to 500,000 bucks by doing that. And the decision was, do we want to increase class size for all the teachers and give them less opportunity to take care of students and student work and conferencing, et cetera, et cetera? Or can we struggle with a much smaller administrative structure? And so that was the decision that we made. The slimmed down administrative structure, the dean's team, lasted, it's still in existence. They've added, because there's more students now, they added some associate deans, but basically we continue to save money on that decision. But I say this, not to demonstrate that we have to get rid of administration, because administration today is pretty thinned down. We actually eliminated about $1 million from central office administration last year. But I'm just saying that because there are very few choices at the schoolhouse level and then at the central office level as well now. Schools are not fat organizations. They're pretty basic, functional organizations, and there's not much to cut. And so what we're facing now is an existential threat to this city, to this community, where class sizes are going to go to 35 if we don't get the override. 35? That's completely nuts. It's not Brookline. We're going to probably lose fire department, firefighters. We're going to lose police officers. So this is a crisis. And all the information that David and Sadaf provided in terms of the finances, it's all true. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll be quiet. I go back to 1787 when Elizabeth Powell went to Benjamin Franklin on the last day of the Constitutional Convention. She said, Benjamin, she said, after all is said and done, are we going to have a republic or an autocracy? And he said, you're going to have a republic if you can keep it. And then fast forward 2026, that's the same kind of question that we face in Brookline today. Can we keep Brookline, the community, with the great schools, the great public services that we have, or not? And all of us here certainly think that Brookline is a community that we love and we want to continue to love and have the kind of services that people move here for. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. I just want to put one piece to what David was saying. I got a parking ticket today. And the calculations about if we talk about the median family home, which is about 1.15 million assessed value in Brookline, the tax increases for that will be less than 1 parking ticket a month. Just to put all of this, Bob's talking about, like, what is the community worth to us? So I think for me, that was an interesting perspective looking at my parking ticket today. Going on, I think we've started to talk about question 3. Bob, you were starting to talk about it. So I want to kind of ask it, knowing that part of it was already answered, but and maybe Sadaf can talk a little about this. What have the schools in town done to manage their budget for the 3 years for fiscal 27, which starts on July 1st of this year, which is the first year that the override funds, through fiscal year 29, which is the 3rd year that the override funds. So what have they done to manage their budgets and ultimately to keep the override number low?
Yeah. So I'm happy to address that. I actually really liked Bob's story around the house structure, even though I'm Robert's house for life, right? But it was a really good point, right? Because the thing is that this was something that had been in place for a long time, and I think that strong leadership is demonstrated by making difficult decisions in difficult times, right? To me, that is the sign of a strong leader. One of the things that I observed through my role within the Expenditures and Revenues Study Committee was that the town administrator and his team and our superintendent and her team really made difficult decisions in coming up with the budgets that they presented. So they didn't bring budgets with a lot of fat that they expected to get cut. For anybody who's gone through sort of budgeting processes, right? There's a game that people play sometimes in that regard. But the town made a number of reductions when they put together their budget. There were 5 FTEs that were cut, so that was about $425,000 worth of cuts. There's a reduction to the CIP, the capital improvements fund that we have by about 10%. That was almost $900,000 worth of cuts. So there was some additional cuts that were made to actually put together a right-sized budget for the committee to evaluate and for the select board ultimately to evaluate. Similarly, on the school side, Superintendent Wong and her team took a hard look at our current staffing, and they cut over 22 FTEs within the schools. And that was, no doubt, those were difficult decisions. Some of that was done to right size based on lower enrollment. The right decision, I think, and a lot of questions had been asked around enrollment and sort of commensurate staffing. So I think that Superintendent Wong answered those questions. And they made a difficult decision to reduce educational technology staff as well. They took a look at tech leases and right-sized those. They reorged the central office. They did early retirement incentives, transportation contracts were revisited. So what I saw through the process that I was a part of was that there was truly a good faith effort on the part of the town and the schools to take a really hard look at the budget and to make difficult decisions to put forward a budget that had already been pressure tested and right sized for things that are viable to do in the short term. So I think that that's an important piece of context. I thought that was sort of a good point to sort of dovetail on the story that Bob told about the House structure and the administration and the difficult budget times that he had experienced when he was leading BHS.
Great, thanks. Bob or David, would you like to add anything to this?
I've known Superintendent Wong for a while, for many years actually. She actually came here at a leadership seminar that I sponsored with the Brookline Parent Organization and Boston University at the formerly the Devotion School, and she was one of the presenters. And again, I knew her well, and one of the things I knew very well about Bella, who, by the way, everybody graduated from Brookline High School in 1978. Go Bella Wong. She was state track star. She loves Brookline, and she's really excited to be back here. But what I'm saying is that, for example, she was an interim superintendent in Natick a few years ago. And during that year, she prepared that, in 1 year, without knowing the community well, she prepared that community for a vote to override Proposition 2.5 in Natick. And she stayed for 1 year. The vote was in the fall and it passed, which is an example of her proven ability to manage the finances of a school system. So when she agreed to come here and then agreed to stay here, I can really reassure the community that after a bunch of years of less than spectacular financial management in the system, we now have Superintendent Bella Wong, who is a master at school finance. And she's quickly achieved the respect of town leaders, including Chaz, and school leaders, including all the principals. They are thrilled to have Bella Wong to be their leader. And so that's a super game changer. And I think we're on the threshold of something really great over the next few years, including the most important component of this, which is to manage the financial crisis that we continue to have.
Great. Thanks, Bob. David?
Yes, so on the town side, there have been many efficiencies that have been gained. So, for example, the town legal department has hired some additional lawyers to try to reduce the amount of outsourcing that had taken place in prior years, and that's realizing savings. As part of the town school partnership, there are ongoing conversations about how to try to avoid duplication of certain administrative services that are needed by both the town side and the school side. Then, more negatively, given the limited amount of resources, there are 6 positions in the police department that have remained vacant for a significant period of time. And similarly, on the fire department side, there have been discussions about the number of firefighters per truck as and adjusting that model as a potential means to reduce overtime costs. This could ultimately lead to closing a fire company. Another reason why it's critically important that this override pass. But the town's doing what it can to try to find internal efficiencies without having people lose jobs. Some responsibilities have been reassigned to existing personnel as opposed to bringing on new hires. There is an entire division, the sustainability division, which is currently grant-based. And so a lot of efforts are made to try to really safeguard the finite resources that we have before going to the taxpayers asking for increases.
Great. Thank you, David. So the next question, I want to talk a little about, this kind of like chatter that's been going around. There's, Brookline News articles or an article last year, about financial mismanagement within the schools. Some accusations were made, concern was raised in the CLA report last May. So can you guys talk a little bit about this? Was there actually financial malfeasance of any kind? David, do you want to talk about that, or Sadaf wants to?
I can start, and then other people can chime in. We did take a look at the work that CLA did and completed last May, and then there were some follow-up audits as well. So some of the accusations that were made by the individual from central office who was leaving were related to financial mismanagement, specifically of special education funds. The CLA report that was completed last May identified, didn't actually state that there was financial misfeasance. It did point out some opportunities from a process improvement standpoint that the schools went on to tackle. And there was an IDEA grant audit that was done by the state, and that came back clean, right? So that was actually a formal audit that the state does periodically, and they looked at the usage of those funds, and what they came up with was that there was no misuse of that grant funding, right? So there's been sort of multiple data points that say that there wasn't financial misfeasance, which were, some allegations that were made by that individual who departed from central office. There was actually a follow-up CLA report or sort of analysis that was done over the last several weeks. As of, let's see, actually, I don't know if it'll show up in tomorrow's select board meeting or not. But there was a draft of it that was shared on March 31st. And based on what CLA found was that the schools have actually addressed the majority of the opportunities that they had identified in last year's analysis. And overall, the disposition was positive, right? They even make a statement that, overall the disposition is positive. There's a couple things to sort of close out. And that was part of the recommendation that the E&R committee had made, that, we thought it would be helpful to have a third party to come back and actually look at this. And so CLA was enlisted to do that work. The final report has not been published, but that interim report was published, and I expect the final report will be published any day now. David or Bob, somebody else on this call might have actually seen that before it's been made public. So I think overall, a positive trajectory. I think and I think the third party reviews are actually incredibly helpful. And so I think that that's, sort of critical for the community to understand. And there's one other thing that I did want to point out is that, I think for a lot of people, they watched the budget process for fiscal 26, and that was a really bumpy process, right? So myself included, as a parent of 2 students in PSB, I think the process was not ideal last year. And I will say that the process this year was also very different, having sort of watched that one very, very closely, having watched the prior one, primarily on Zoom. And I think that a lot of that is really due to the new leadership that we have in the central office. So that can't be sort of understated. What a critical component of that of the puzzle that is.
Thank you, Sadaf. One point. Somebody raised their hand. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. That's the best way to get to us. And there's a few questions we'll try to get to. But there was one super quick question I thought we could answer. What does CLA mean?
Oh, I'm sorry.
What does CLA stand for?
Clifton Larson Allen.
Name of the consulting firm.
Yes, that's right. So they're an auditing firm that does these types of reviews.
Ben, I can say one more thing about, the rumors of financial impropriety or incompetence, whatever. I certainly wasn't on the school committee. I wasn't part of the system over the past bunch of years. But after COVID, as everybody knows, that a lot of cities and towns received money from the federal government for a few years. And so from my understanding, these are the rumors that were all over the place, that the administration over those few years did not do a great job of anticipating the end of that funding. Maybe David knows more about it than I do, but it seemed that the funding was there for 3 years, I believe, and then it just stopped. And I think that the planning was not great, and that was one of the reasons that people viewed the municipal finance component of what we're talking about here as not that great. Of course, that's a few years past already, and so as Sadaf and everybody else is saying, that we're under a new leadership team, and Bella's building a very strong central office team, and I'm not at all concerned about any kind of misuse of funds coming in here for the next bunch of years. I think we're in good shape.
As Bob just mentioned, so with ARPA funds, those were one-time only funds. And because there's this structural deficit, there's a constant annual strain each year with the budget. And so those one-time funds were sometimes used for recurring expenses. And that is not a sustainable model. And so that did create some longer-term problems once that one-time money had been fully exhausted. Brookline is not the only community that made that error, frankly, in spending one-time funds for recurring revenues. And fortunately, with the new leadership in place, I trust that they won't repeat that error.
There was also instability at the central command. I think that we went through about 5 business and finance deputy superintendents over those years as well. So that was a huge problem as well, and that problem is solved.
Thank you all. I guess we've kind of answered the next, but we're kind of getting
we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Because my next question is what do you guys think of the current, leadership? Like David, you were on school committee for 6 years. You spent 2 years on select board. Sadaf, you spent a year on E&R. And Bob, you're an educational leader for many years in town, then you joined town meeting and now school committee. So I want to know not just about school. You've talked a little about schools leadership. I'd actually also like to know if you have anything else you want to add about schools leadership. That's great. I know we talked a lot about it. I'd also like to know how you feel about town leadership, because that's a big part of this equation as well. So maybe David, if you want to start.
Yes, I can get into some more specifics. So during my tenure on school committee, we looked at where we could cut non-student facing positions. Many cuts were made to central office, including the entire Office of Strategy and Performance, which had 4 to 6 people in it at various times, and even a deputy superintendent. More controversially, of course, world language instruction from grades K through 6 was eliminated. Heath, now Hayes, was intentionally put on a trajectory to become more of a 2-section school, meaning 2 classes per grade level, in order to try to open up enough classrooms for additional special education programming. That was in an effort to reduce out-of-district special education placements where appropriate. There were also reductions made in computer leases. There was a scaling back on professional development. There were adjustments to bus routing and transportation models to try to improve efficiencies in those areas. Since coming over to Select Board, on the town side, there have been 5 full-time equivalent positions that were eliminated across departments, and those responsibilities shared among remaining personnel. There have been enterprise fund and user pay programs that have been implemented, including pay as you throw, solid waste system. There have been fee increases, such as for building permits, parking violation fines, Ben, and other municipal service charges. This has netted about $2 million in recurring savings per year. There's been some scaling back on capital spending, but of course that carries some risks because if you don't maintain your buildings on the right schedule, that can lead to larger costs down the road, but occasionally with tight budgets, that's necessary. There have been some increased efficiencies within certain departments. I mentioned earlier the legal department having done that in an effort to avoid duplication of administrative services and too much outsourcing. There have been ongoing reviews of public safety staffing models, management of overtime, revenue diversification efforts around local meals tax and other local receipts, and pursuit of commercial and mixed growth opportunities, such as Chestnut Hill West rezoning, which will be voted on by town meeting in May.
And okay, in terms of you, the question was about leadership too, Ben, right?
Yeah. Like I want
So-
to hear about, your, like, I want to hear like on top of that amazing exhaustive list, I also want to hear about your guys' experience. Like, how do you feel about the town leadership right now?
So I can chime in a little bit. I mentioned that during the ENR process there was this, I thought a really strong good faith effort from the town administrator Chaz Carey as well as Superintendent Bella Wong to make some really difficult decisions and difficult cuts. And I know some of those decisions on the town side, that was hard for town staff, right? And I think that one of the things that I witnessed in that process was that our town administrator was trying to do the right thing, was trying to put a number forward that was had been pressure tested, that made some really difficult decisions, that made some cuts. I know David, enumerated a bunch of those efforts, and I think that it was just a sincere effort to really address the things that were short term. I witnessed something similar on Bella's part. And the one other thing I'll say about Superintendent Wong is that she dropped into an incredibly difficult situation. She joined on July 1st. ENR had been up and running for a few months. Everybody's chomping at the bit for data and numbers and budgets and this and that. It's an override year. It's a contract negotiation year. The central office was decimated. People had left, right? So she had one deputy superintendent in place, right? 2 vacancies, a bunch of other vacancies across the organization. It was incredibly difficult situation. I was not envious of her position, right? This is not a town that doesn't want something yesterday. And so, over the course of the next 6 months or so, or a little bit more, she spent time really trying to understand the departments, how they're working, where the opportunities are. And the budget that she put forward was, frankly, later than we had wanted to see it. But she stood behind it, right? So she had done the due diligence to actually put forward numbers that she felt confident in. And then she would go back and revise them and make additional cuts and make additional cuts and make additional cuts. So it wasn't something that was sort of moving up and down. And even though as an ENR committee, we wanted to see that budget, we would have wanted to see that budget in July, right? Shortly after she got here. I actually really admired her backbone in saying that it's not ready yet. And therefore, in really holding the line and bringing that forward when she felt confident bringing that forward. And that's not easy. And I can say that as, somebody who's managed people for a long time, or, anybody who's led organizations or who's been in situations like that where there is a lot of pressure. That takes a lot of a lot of leadership and a lot of confidence and to make those difficult decisions and to hold the line under high pressure situations like that. So I thought that was worth sharing because I think that was, from my perspective, even though I didn't always get the answer that I was looking for, um, I think she made the right decisions in those difficult circumstances for the district and for the community.
So one of the reasons I ran for school committee was my concern about the instability and leadership in the system. Because if you have stable leadership, you build the community, you build the organization. You don't have people coming and going with their own. Oh, we have some new plans, and then we got some more new plans, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and again, I draw upon my own experience. I was fortunate when I was the head of Brookline High to have Jim Walsh for 13 years as the superintendent, who was incredible, and then Bill Lupini was selected to be a long again and serve for a long time. Um, and that stability, I think, really contributed to the stability of the school system. And so today, we got Bella Wong committed to 5 years here, which is hugely important. She'll build our team. Robin Benoit has just come on board. I hope she'll be here with us. And we're now looking for a new business and finance deputy superintendent. Karen Schmuckler came back because of Bella Wong, and she's an extraordinary leader in the student services department. And there's a lot of stability among the principals right now. Um, I know Anthony Meyer's been at the head of the high school for 10 years. That's huge. You build that way. You build an organization that way. And there's a bunch of elementary principals who've been here for a while as well. And so I think looking down the road, looking forward, I feel really confident that the lack of stability that has been in evidence in our school system for a bunch of years is over, and that stability will be here, and we'll be able to um, build an organization because of that stability of leadership.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Unless you have anything to add, David, I'll move to the next question.
Similarly, on the town side, we have very stable leadership. The finance department has had many of the same senior personnel for a significant period of time, such as Melissa Goff. Chaz Carey has now been town administrator for a few years, and he recently had his contract extended. These are very thoughtful, prudent people who really try to maximize efficiencies, work together with their partners on the school side to achieve the best results with limited dollars. And so I think we have the right teams in place on both the school side and the town side to have more financially sustainable trajectories moving forward.
Great. Thanks, David. So the next question I want to move to is about the override, about this override specifically. And the question is, why is the override the number that it is? Like, how do we get to this number? Why is this the override that's on the ballot?
So I can start, and then other people should absolutely jump in. So I mentioned before that there's sort of a set of shared services, and when you get revenue in, those shared services are paid for first. And then the remaining is actually split between the town and the schools. And that's split roughly 40% to the town and 60% to the schools, roughly. There's some sort of iteration of that by allocations or chargebacks over the course of the year. But that's kind of the high level formula. And what we've seen and are seeing over the next several years is that those shared services are basically taking up the incremental revenue that we expect to raise over the next 3 years. As a result, there is less to split among the town and the schools. So people will often talk about, the schools and, what their allocation is, which is essentially flat year over year for the next 3 years, flat to slightly down. But the town has a similar problem, right? So with those shared services, primarily driven by healthcare and sort of other rising costs, taking up the incremental revenue that's raised, you have to sort of deal with a flat revenue situation year over year, flat allocation. So the school override number is just shy of 18 million, and the town is 5.3 million. The school budget driver is really salaries, which makes up about 87% of the budget. And if you think about that, there really isn't a lot of other stuff left to cut, right? So it really is when you start to make cuts in, a failed override situation, which we hope not to be in, it really it ends up impacting headcount within the school system. The school budget is growing, by a little bit less than 5% in fiscal 27. Almost $2 million of that is actually driven by some of the circuit breaker funding that was used to close the gap in fiscal 27, fiscal 26, if people remember that. Then it's a little shy of 4%, around 5%. So typically somewhere in the 4% range, which is actually typical of the growth in past years as well. The gap is really that the allocation is flat year over year because of that growing cost of the shared services. So I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, that, there isn't sort of, a whole bunch of nice to haves that are being added, or, extra spending that's sort of coming out of nowhere. This is really, sort of a situation of rising costs that a lot of communities are contending with.
I would just add that the way the 2023 override was structured, it only addressed part of the town and schools' underlying budget gap. It left ongoing cost pressures to be managed in subsequent years. And that was in an effort to try to not increase property taxes by too much. Some people feel that perhaps the ask was too low back then because many were disappointed by the degree of cuts that took place even in the aftermath of passing that override. The schools saw no increase in their annual allocation during the last 3 years. And because of that, the override includes some funding that in prior years would typically have been addressed through the usual annual increases to the school budget.
I think that folks need to understand that even with this rather robust override, and thank you, Select Board, for making that decision, because obviously we're all aware of the magnitude of the cuts that would be necessary with no override. But I think that there are still going to be 22 positions eliminated from the schools, including librarians, technology people, some administration. Even with the override, you still lose 22 positions, and you also lose about $1.5 million from the town side as well. So people have to understand that, this, it is a robust override. It's 23.25 million bucks. And the select board could have made other decisions about the nature of the override, but with a lower number, it would have meant additional serious cuts. And without the override, we're talking about getting rid of the conservatory music program in the middle schools, talking about getting rid of world language in the middle schools. We're talking about class sizes in many schools, 35, 36. So it is clear that without an override and without a robust override, this Brookline would be in crisis. And I've said this many times, Brookline would not look like Brookline because people move here for those very services, for great schools, for great public safety, for great public services. And without a robust override, that would be dramatically changed, and that would be disturbing. So even if there was a lower number for the override, we would still have to cut significantly, more than we're going to do anyway, even with the robust override. So that's just the way it is. And the amount of money that each of us would pay with a lower override really is not that much of a difference. And so I strongly hope that the community comes out strongly in favor of this robust override to really preserve the existential character of our community.
I'm going to jump now to this question, and it's come up a little bit in the Q&A, and I think it's a good time to talk about it. And you can start with Sadaf, and then have David talk a little, because Sadaf, on ENR, on the Expenditures and Revenues Committee, the committee did work on the long-term financial considerations for the town. So what are some of your takeaways on what the town can do after this override to make sure future overrides are smaller and farther apart?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, this is something that that we did think about. So I mentioned that the town, the schools made a really good faith effort to make cuts that were straightforward. And then there are longer term opportunities, right? Those longer term opportunities just take longer fundamentally, or they're more complex to implement. And there were recommendations related to that within the E&R report. People can, read those in greater detail if they want. But some of the highlights were, the first one was really, that I think is worth mentioning, is economic development. So continuing to invest in economic development, commercial real estate development specifically. There is a large portion of our tax base, the majority of our tax base is residential real estate. Commercial real estate adds to that tax base and alleviates the pressure on residential taxpayers when you have additional commercial real estate revenue, right? So this is an important thing for us to consider, as well as other revenue opportunities across town. There's smaller revenue opportunities that we had recommended. So looking at additional rental income from recreational facilities, right? So really thinking about launching a pilot to actually streamline how our school facilities and other facilities are rented, to make sure that we're maximizing the revenue that could come from that. And taking a hard look at other facilities rentals that we have or that we're doing, to make sure that they're paying market rate. Taking a look at BEAT financials to make sure that that's breaking even. And then there were a series of cost savings opportunities as well. And a number of these, as well as a couple of the ones that I mentioned around facilities rentals, as well as BEAT revenue, were actually proposed as part of a memorandum of understanding that actually the town and the schools have drafted, and I think should be finalized any minute now. And it's basically a commitment to actually take a look at these longer term opportunities. And the specific ones around cost include the town and the schools partnering to negotiate reduced healthcare premium contributions on the part of the town for town and school employees, and to make sure that that contribution is more similar to comparable communities. Because right now ours is higher than other comparable communities. The reason this is in more of the long-term structures, this requires renegotiation with a number of different unions, somewhere between 5 and 9. I know of 5, but I was told that there are more. So it's a non-trivial undertaking. It's complex, and it's not something that happens overnight, and certainly not something that's going to happen before May 5th. Right, so that's a longer-term undertaking, but potentially cost savings. We ask that the schools take a look at wage expenses and try to bring those in line with sort of projected year over year revenue increases. Also considering balancing that we have to make sure that this is a place that teachers want to work, right? So that's obviously a critical component. You have to be able to hire and retain talented teachers. Also taking a look at the school model was something where we thought that there was potentially some cost savings. And there was a series of other recommendations that we made that were included in the memorandum of understanding. There were a couple of other things on the energy side, so some investment in solar that the town is pursuing that will actually save approximately $400,000 a year in energy costs once that's fully online, as well as taking a look at electrical demand management. Some really good nuggets in there for people who are interested in reading all of the details. But lots of interesting ideas in there. And I thought I was really happy to see both the town and the schools agree to actually undertake that memorandum of understanding and agree to commit to actually taking a look at these longer term cost structure opportunities, so that over time, the goal is to help manage both the size and the frequency of overrides in the future.
Great. Thank you, Sadaf. I'll move directly to unless, David, you have anything to add to this? Or?
Well, just briefly. So we've been working on the comprehensive plan that's been shared by Paul Warren. And part of the goal of that is, what is the Brookline that we envision for the future? What are the best uses for certain neighborhoods and different locations in town? What are some economic growth opportunities that might be available to us so that we can expand the proverbial pie in terms of bringing in more revenue through new growth? I referenced Chestnut Hill West earlier. There will be other projects down the line that get explored. Select Board is very committed to trying to become less dependent on residential taxpayers. And so that's an ongoing process. But again, as Sadaf mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight. And so that's why overrides become a necessary stopgap to try to bridge us to a time when hopefully we will have more revenue coming in. To put into perspective what one significant project can accomplish, the Chestnut Hill West project is estimated to bring in between 5 and 7 million a year in net new revenue. If we had that already up and running right now, we possibly wouldn't be having an override on the ballot this year because that would cover the entire ask of the schools. So economic growth does matter a lot. Select Board and town staff are very well aware of it, and we're committed to easing the residential tax burden.
Great. Thank you, David. So I want to jump to some school stuff, and you've talked a little about this, Bob, but some people are asking, like, why are we going to see cuts to the world language and the conservatory program next year? Like, why aren't we cutting something else, starting with the next school year? So could you talk a little about that?
Without the override?
Without
Excuse
the
me.
override, exactly. Why are those the cuts on offer in year one? Why aren't there other cuts?
Well, as I said,
more administration or something like that?
Well, as I said at the beginning, schools are not fat organizations. They're pretty slimmed down organizations. There's not really a lot to cut. So if you look inside of a school, as I mentioned before, you have a principal, an assistant principal, a secretary, a few counselors, a bunch of teachers, cafeteria workers, custodians. That's what's there. There's not a lot to cut. And so when you have to make those kind of tough decisions, if there's no money, we're talking about world language 6 through 8. That would be embarrassing for the Brookline Public Schools not to have world language at those levels in this, increasingly, multicultural world that we live in, including in Brookline. So, I mean, why would we cut world language? We should not be cutting world language. Should we be cutting the Conservatory of Music program? Of course not. It's one of our prides and joys in Brookline that in the recent state music festivals that they had, Brookline did so well. Orchestral music, jazz music. We have historically had tremendous fine arts, performing arts programs. But, you look around, where do you cut? I said we cut $1 million out of the central office. Bella has been working 24/7 to make this school year work without a big team up there. And maybe down the road she can build up a team a little bit better. I was one of the loud voices historically that said, don't touch kid-facing people. And central office is obviously vulnerable with that kind of a philosophy. But there's just not that much to cut. Do we want to cut music? Of course not. Do we want to? The high school's got this incredible fine and performing arts program, the envy of the world, dance, all sorts of ceramics. The arts programs of the high school, amazing. You do not want to cut those programs because not everybody is an academic star, but maybe they are talented in the arts. And if you don't have an arts program, it makes them less likely to love school. And so we need to have a comprehensive school system that offers programming for the broad spectrum of kids who walk in the doors. And so, I just can't imagine having to cut the two programs that you mentioned, the conservatory program and the world language program. It's nuts. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, taxes are the price we pay for civilization. Well, taxes are the price we pay for a decent school system and for decent town services, public safety, town services. and people say taxes, taxes, taxes. There is skepticism all the time in terms of why do we have to pay so many taxes? But if you examine the way we spend money in Brookline, I think we're incredibly responsible, incredibly conservative in the way we spend money. Brookline is the second smartest community in the country. We were recently ranked the number one place in the country to live. Why? Because of all the things that we're talking about tonight. And so it goes back to Benjamin Franklin. Do we want Brookline to be the Brookline that we love and we know and love? And that's the question for the override. And hopefully down the road, we're going to continue to be smart and try not to have, overrides every 3 years and get some more commercial development like David and Sadaf are talking about. We're smart. We can do this. But right now we are in a very dangerous situation, and we have to pass this override.
David, I wanted to ask you, because we've talked about cuts, right? Cuts to the schools in year one, this world language and music, and then like basically hundreds of teachers cut in year 2 and 3, classroom teachers, class sizes going up to 30, 35, and loss of fire company on the town side, police officer positions not filled, all of these cuts, right? What are some of the like lesser known dangers of a failed override? So like if the override fails beyond the cuts, what happens to our town in this failed override scenario?
So there's the potential impact on our bond rating. A failed override could have significant financial consequences beyond the service cuts that you just referenced, Ben. It could include pressure on our town's credit rating, also known as bond rating. This matters because the bond rating affects how much the town pays to borrow money for major projects like school constructions, road maintenance, general infrastructure. Brookline currently holds a AAA municipal bond rating that is the highest possible credit rating. Only 15 of the 351 municipalities in Massachusetts have a AAA municipal bond rating. So again, Brookline is already near the top there, and that is based on our financial practices. A AAA rating signals that a town has strong financial management, that it has stable revenues and reserves, that lenders view it as extremely low risk to lend to, and this allows Brookline to borrow money at significantly lower interest rates. On a large capital project of, say, $200 to $300 million, even a modest rating downgrade that led to a 0.25 to 0.5% higher interest rate would cost millions of dollars in additional interest payments over the life of the bonds. That means more tax dollars going to debt payments rather than to services and what the money was designed to produce as a town amenity. Another area that can be impacted by a failed override is the desirability to live in a community. So property values tend to be perceived as higher when you're in a community that has a high quality of life, that supports a robust, high quality public school system, that has public safety with fully staffed fire departments, fully staffed police departments that have many officers available for patrol or investigations, and firefighters who can help improve response times in emergency scenarios. People want to live in communities like that, and currently Brookline offers those types of amenities, and we would stand to potentially lose some of them if this override doesn't pass. There would be less infrastructure maintenance, reduced recreational opportunities, reduced library programming, fewer community initiatives such as the senior shuttle. So there are a lot of implications that go beyond some of the services we were talking about within the schools and within the town.
Thank you, David. None of that sounds very good to me. So we've spoken a lot about the override in schools. And we've talked a little bit about the town side stuff, but I do think it's important to talk about for the folks who don't have kids in the schools. So what is the override doing for these people, for this segment of our community? And what does a failed override look like for them? So David, if you want to kick it off on this one.
Yes. So I grew up in Brookline. I've been in Brookline since I was 4 years old. My kids are very young, and so they have not yet benefited from the public school system. But there are many others like me who plan to have their kids go through the schools, and there are many others in older generations who themselves benefited from the schools and from other town services. Many like to give back to the community that has given so much to them. And quality of life does come at a cost. Factors beyond our immediate control, such as inflation, unfunded federal mandates, rising healthcare premiums, place considerable pressure on our budget, as they are in municipal budgets all across the state. Costs are rising even when there are carefully considered cuts to services. And that's why passing the override is critical to preserving our high quality of life. People value our town services beyond schools. They value our park system, our libraries. They value street maintenance, curb maintenance, accessibility, certain things that we sometimes take for granted on a day-to-day basis, but the town is providing those services for us. People also value public safety. Fewer firefighters could affect response times. There are also a lot of senior initiatives, as I mentioned before, that perhaps would no longer be available in the event of a failed override. So while there is a lot of discussion around the impact on schools, there's a lot of impact on the town side as well. And both the schools and the town as a whole impact property values, as I said, and the overall desirability to live in a community. As Bob referenced, Brookline was ranked #1 nationally by US News for quality of life. Is paying a bit more than you already do to live in the #1 ranked municipality in quality of life worth it? I certainly think so. And I expect that many others will too. That's why most of us choose to live here.
Does anyone else have anything you want to add to this? So there are a few. I think we answered most of the questions. There was a question about home assessments going up, and I think it's important to talk about like where does a home assessment fit in like the larger Prop 2.5 override tax picture, because it's not just that the town is arbitrarily raising home assessments, right? There's a factor between the home assessments and the tax rate and the total tax levy. So, David or Sadaf, could you just talk a little bit about how home assessment and home assessed value figures into like tax calculations?
So this is not my area of expertise. So I don't know, David, if this is a question that you can take. I don't want to misspeak on this.
Yes, I confess this is not an area of my expertise either in terms of how home assessments are calculated exactly. But what I can say more broadly that I referenced before is that property values certainly vary in part based, or market value at least, based on the perception of the quality of a community one lives in. So many people say that Brookline has high property costs because of its proximity to Boston, where a lot of people work. And that's true to an extent. But if that were the full explanation, then why do many people find Brookline more desirable to live in than West Roxbury or other residential parts of Boston that have more of a suburban feel to it, or more urban parts of Boston as well, for those of us who live in the more urban parts of Brookline? So there are reasons why Brookline is more expensive beyond its proximity to Boston, and a lot of that is based on our quality of life. So while that's not a precise answer to about assessed home values, ultimately it's really the market value of a property that I think homeowners are most concerned about. What are they going to be able to sell their home for down the line? Or if they are passing it along to the next generation, are they setting that next generation up well financially? And you certainly are in a community that has high quality of life. And high quality of life means high quality schools and high quality services.
Great. Thank you, David. I think my understanding of the question also has to do with tax rates, right? Because the Prop 2.5 says the total amount of taxes that the town can collect can only go up 2.5. And so the override is raising that. I think, as you said, David, like, I forget the exact numbers, 2.96% in year one. Was it 1.5 something in year two, and then 2 something in year three? So no matter how much the home value rises, the taxes can only go up so much. You have a limit by Prop 2.5, and then whatever the override adds onto that. So it's not just arbitrarily raising home assessments, because if home assessments go up beyond what the tax levy can increase, the tax rate actually goes down. So when we calculate what the increases are going to be, that's based on what the assessed value is currently, but a higher assessed value does not mean those taxes will be higher. The taxes are going up by a certain percentage, like the actual dollar amount. So I feel like that might be part of the question. It wasn't super clear from the question, but I feel like that's an important thing to clarify. That it's the actual dollar amount that is constrained by state law and by the override that's on the ballot. So I think we talked about structural deficit. So I think because we're over time, I'll see if we can get answers to these elsewhere, any of these other questions. But so it's already 9:15. I want to kind of move to the closing because we've been here a while, and I appreciate everyone's time and don't want to take too much of it. So to finish, obviously, all of us here have endorsed yes on the override. And so I'd like to go around and talk about what would be what is the number one reason why you've endorsed yes? And if you were talking to your neighbor and they were asking, well, why should I vote yes? What would you say to them? So I'd like to start with Sadaf.
Sure. So I think for me, this has been sort of a journey, so to speak. When I started working on E&R a little bit more than a year ago, I actually really wasn't sure if I would be in support of an override this year. I think, Ben, you and I had this conversation, one-on-one many times. And what I observed through the process was really a good faith effort on the part of the town and the schools to really take a hard look at costs and address the things that are viable to do in the short term. What's outstanding is the stuff that's harder to do. I mentioned some of the things that take longer. And there's now a commitment through this MOU to actually take a look at those as well. And so as I look at that and really the efforts on the part of, for example, Superintendent Wong to take a hard look and sort of, tackle things that have been raised 10, 12 years ago, like bringing in students from other districts into some of our special education program for tuition. Some of these things that have been discussed for a long time that she is willing to really take a look at and act on. I really believe that the short-term opportunities, we've tackled those. Anything else might be on the margins. And the longer term opportunities with that commitment, I want to give the town and the schools the time to tackle the longer term opportunities, right? So I see supporting this override as a commitment to give our leaders the time to tackle the bigger problems. And in the meantime, to continue to fund the community that I grew up in, that I love, that I brought my kids back to raise them here, and to continue to live in the Brookline that we know and love today.
Thank you, Sadaf. David, if you could go next.
Very similar to Sadaf, but what I would add is that having looked at the numbers in detail and having seen firsthand on both the school side and now on the town side on select board, the effort that's been made to try to deal with the proverbial low-hanging fruit that might help with our finances, that's been done already. And there really isn't much more that can be done absent having a past override to support the level of services that we've grown accustomed to here in Brookline. As I referenced before, we have those rising healthcare premiums. That's not something that is Brookline's fault. This is something that is being dealt with nationally, certainly statewide. It's why so many communities have overrides on their ballot. In addition to that, specifically to the schools, we have a mostly unfunded mandate with special education. The federal government and state government do not provide enough support to local communities. And Brookline has higher than average numbers in special education. And it's great that we're a community that values that. And we certainly must follow federal law, of course, but it does create financial challenges. And that's not the fault of anyone in Brookline. That is not due to mismanagement. It's simply a financial reality. And then there's inflation. So having all of these external factors imposing financial pressures on Brookline, we are in a situation where either we're going to make cuts that are potentially quite devastating almost across the board, or we'll pass this override so that we can maintain the quality of life that we've had in Brookline while simultaneously engaging in this longer term strategic planning to try to make the structural changes that are necessary to ease the residential tax burden moving forward. And that gets back to what I was saying around exploring commercial growth opportunities.
Great. Thank you, David. And Bob, I'll let you close it out.
Okay. Thank you, Ben, for organizing this. People sometimes are cynical, skeptical about politics and politicians, but having been a public servant basically all my life, I have come to a definition of politics that I think is a high level sense of what politics is all about. And politics is the way a community decides to live together. Politics is the way we decide what kind of community we want to live in. And so here we are in a political environment where we're making a decision about overriding Proposition 2.5. So to me, that's really, it's an idealistic environment to live in. A democracy, which obviously is threatened all over the place, although congratulations to the guy who beat Orban yesterday. Good job. Pro-democracy in Hungary. Hopefully that happens in our country soon as well. But anyway, so I just love politics because it's an exchange of ideas. It's a way to decide what this community needs. And I think we should celebrate the fact that we're having these conversations. I think we should celebrate the fact that the Select Board, a democratic institution, has decided to ask us to be generous to support the community. You know, that's to me, that's the bottom line, that we've had the discussions. Sadaf has been part of them. David has been part of the conversations. We've all been part of them formally and informally. And we've decided to have a vote on May 5th about the way we want to live together in this community. And it means spending a little bit more money from our pockets. So maybe we can cut back on some dinners over the course of a year, or cut back on some expenses that maybe are a little bit more frivolous, in order to celebrate our democracy and in order to celebrate the services that we receive by living in this community. So that's my response to, why the override, because the override is all about us figuring out together, ultimately voting the kind of services that we want for each other, for our kids, for our seniors, for our safety, for our education. So vote yes, May 5th for Brookline. Keep Brookline, Brookline.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you, David. Thank you, Sadaf, and thank you everybody for joining us. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate everybody taking their time to talk about this thing that's very important to our town, and the three of you bringing your expertise, your experience to this conversation, not just tonight, but through the whole time leading up to this, and then, you know, on to election day and beyond. I feel very lucky to be represented by so many, you know, very intelligent, very thoughtful, and very careful individuals, and to be part of this amazing community. If you want to know how much your tax bills will actually go up, look at you know, look at the tax calculator. The town has one. Both Yes and No have one. They're pretty much the same. But you can go to yesbrookline.com and you can put your address in and you'll get your average tax bill increase due to the override. And yes, we hope you'll vote yes on May 5th. Feel free to, you know, ask us any questions, and we'll send this recording out as soon as we can. And we look forward to seeing you at the next BPO event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.